So let's start with our first panel, and we will start with the basic raw material that is paper. So it will really focus on the material of paper itself. We will quickly see that this subject can be approached from multiple different angles, from the analysis of paper making to the use of different paper types in a printmaking workshop or its multiple material characteristics in a certain geographical and temporal space. Now, to tackle this last point, I am happy to welcome Dr. Sabine Kriebel, who is joining us from University College Cork in Ireland, where she teaches art history and theory. She has published widely on the topic of photography, photomontage, and the interwar European avant-gardes in journals such as CoBrA, Oxford Art Journal, and New German Critique. Secondly, I'm happy to see Emmanuelle Hincelin, who is a freelance paper conservator. She's specialized in modern and contemporary art conservation and regularly studies and publishes about the papers used by modern and contemporary artists, namely the use of cardboards by artists of the 20th and 21st centuries, and Pablo Picasso's use of paper, on whom she will focus her talk today as well. Since 2007, she gives lectures at the INP Département des Restaurateurs, section art graphique, and we are happy to welcome her here today. And then lastly, I want to welcome Dr. Anneke de Vries. She has published abundantly on the Groningen printer and artist H.N. Werkman and contributed on the artist's work catalogue. She was guest curator at Grid Graphic Museum Groningen for a part of the permanent collection called Werkman's Bovenkammer, in which part of the material and equipment handed down from Werkman's printing house is presented in a new way. And last year she also received grants from the Mondrian Fund for the research project Modern Material, de drukkerij-nalatenschap van H.N. Werkman, in which various facets are discussed of Werkman's daily existence as a commercial printer opposite or parallel to his ambitions as an artist. Thank you for being here, and I will leave the floor to Sabine.
So thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I realized it was at first a wonderful opportunity to think about paper, and then I realized I've been thinking about paper the whole time without realizing it. So it was in a wonderful way just to bring a lot of subtending thoughts to the fore. In many ways, paper shares several of the visual and social values as its cousin, photography. The medium is often invisible, it is often devalued, and it is often ubiquitous. On the screen, a framed sheet of wrinkled photographic paper by Wolfgang Tillmans. Its very framing, of course, underscores my point. It seeks to revalue and call attention to the visual and haptic qualities of the surface upon which representation happens. It's a material fact whose existence is inconspicuous and often secondary to the communication that it makes possible. Words, letters, numbers, drawings, photography, stamps, stencil, art, literature, poetry, information, propaganda. All of this signification occurs with the support of paper. Without paper, arguably, Dada would not have spread as quickly as it did throughout Europe. Its message and its tactics conveyed through the artists' magazines that were sold in bookstores and galleries and carried by artists across borders. Without paper, Dada might not have become the phenomenon that it was. In preparing for this symposium, I realized that paper was the problem in two of the exhibitions I was involved in curating. The Persistence of Classicism, Clark Art Institute, Williamstown, Massachusetts, 1995. We wanted to include the discobulous paper cup, ubiquitous in New York City, as part of the evidence of classicism's ever-presence. The cup became contentious, and my choice of representative image on the screen is deliberately not immaculate. Those traces of coffee staining the rim, reminding us of its proximity to the body and to matter. This was not considered art. It did not belong in a vitrine, and thus elevated to the status of something worthy of veneration. A porcelain teacup might have fared differently, but this was paper. It's porous, contaminated by the body and liquid matter, mass-produced, functional, transitory, disposable. The Dada exhibition of 2005 similarly faced challenges during its planning stages. Museological guardians of value and tradition were concerned that certain Dada magazines were printed on cheap, thin paper, damaged, dirty, ephemeral, to be thrown away. In both instances, curatorial vision won out in the end, but it's the point of friction that's the matter. Paper, as it turns out, is not only invisible, but culturally contentious. The privations of World War I rendered paper expedient for art, of course, not only as a surface, but as a medium. Jean Arp's chance collages of 1916-17 traded not only on paper's presence, but on its feather-light weight, falling, half floating, to arrange themselves all too neatly on another page. Johannes Bage's Le Roi Rouge asks us to imagine giving in to the desire to doodle on the wall, tracing our own patterns prompted by pre-given wallpaper design and our unconscious wills. Max Ernst's son Jimmy Ernst later reminisced, "I recalled vividly that this was a piece of wallpaper on my bedroom, and I remembered that when I was 4 or 5, part of the wallpaper next to my bed had buckled, and somebody had torn it off to make this collage of it." The memory was likely an illusion, given that the work was made when the young Jimmy Ernst was but an infant. But his memory certainly attests to the imaginings that Bargel's composition evokes, of paper's proximity, just here on the wall, in arm's reach, its buckling, its fragility, and the itching desires to rip it off. Max Ernst, of course, appropriated pages from books, here the Bibliotheca Pedagogical of 1914, to summon his primordial landscapes. Without the pre-printed paper page, the work wouldn't exist. Sometime in 1921, Cologne Dada artist Angelika Hörle contracted tuberculosis. Her husband, Heinrich Hörle, who was terrified of the disease that killed his father and plagued him in childhood, abandoned Angelika and their mutual apartment. Lying on her deathbed, alone and mortally ill, Angelika Hörle gathered paper fragments about her to draw on, companions in loneliness, lending their surfaces in support of witness. In a series of disturbing, haunting illustrations that confront bodily infirmity and deformity, many are pictorial alter egos that investigate the trappings of femininity and the signs of independence in a period of women's conflicted liberation. A sketch of a woman, thin and hollow-eyed, on the edge of a mutilated paper scrap is presumably a self-portrait. That this self-picturing was performed on a torn scrap of perforated paper is seen on the right, whose vertical edges are hand-ripped and mechanically excised respectively, lend the drawing an impromptu and latently violent urgency. The perforated edge that doubles as her spinal column resembles a serrated knife, offering a disturbingly rational consistency to a hallucinatory and fragmented picture. The sadistic language of severing, imitated by the mutilated edges, is amplified within the drawing itself by a change of crosses that cut her neck and withering, protuberant breast, as if to amputate mind and maternity from the ailing body. in whose womb a plant tragically wilts. This leads me to think about paper's affects. Angelika Hurla's drawings are also examples in which paper's fragile hapticity correlated with post-war affective states to convey our human tenuousness with astonishing poetry. Kurt Schwitter's equally nurtured paper's various textures and layered collages, using its fragility to delicate aesthetic effects that counteract the vulgarity of assembled detritus. His works can be breathtaking in their airy grace. Otto Dix, to cite another example, cultivated paper's various thicknesses in his 1920s Scott players, ranging from nearly translucent newspaper to stubborn cardstock, in order to invoke a range of effects, from vulnerability to willful tenacity in a single picture. The willful interruption of the right-hand player's tumescent thumb as it negotiates the transition from canvas to playing card has always struck this viewer as subversively and delightfully vulgar. Hannah Höch's 1919 cut with a kitchen knife, which shares its home with Dix's card players in Berlin's Neue Nationalgalerie, darkens and buckles with time. The paper sags and releases itself from the tacky glue that affixed it to its surface, accidentally amplifying Albert Einstein's thoughtful brow with wrinkles. Paper tamed. In other instances, however, paper's fragility and haptic agency got in the way. Max Ernst and Hans Arb's Fadagagas, also issued as postcards, take recontextualized paper and photographic fragments and rephotograph them, seeking to do away with paper's obstinacy, to create hallucinations that confuse internal and external reality. Next, John Hartfield, here in paper form, being ignobly bathed like an infant by the poet Else Lasker Schüler in Höchst Montage, in later years sought to address a mass audience with increasing urgency. He embarked on a practice that was wholly dependent on paper and its expediency. Paper was the submissive vessel for information, but quietly, invisibly subversive. His technique focused on suppressing paper's most haptic three-dimensionality to paradoxically summon illusory worlds on paper, convincing the viewer with the dystopic fantasy of their becoming. Paper here became adamantly social, political, communal, robust, but also ephemeral, disposable, and for many decades devalued as mass propaganda. Paper's blunt edges and infra-thin shadows cast by its barely detectable dimensionality were the object of great attention in the production of these montages, momentarily overriding the fraught subject matter itself. Critical contours were carefully shaved by angled scalpels or abraded by sandpaper. Their thickness was thinned as much as possible to create continuity without losing information. The paper fragments were assembled with tweezers to avoid the inadvertent pressure of fingers and the marks of skin oil on paper. Those paper fragments were placed between two heavy glass plates to secure and flatten any wayward matter. Edges, abraded surfaces were retouched both with brushes and with airbrush motored by the human mouth, so that the maker could adjust the pressure with perceptive sensitivity. In these wonderful photographs taken in the late 1960s by Eckhard Siepmann's research team in the raking light, paper takes on an adamant, substantive plasticity. Rather than being something amenable, invisible, and pliant, the paper becomes obstinate, sharp, and raffishly present. Perhaps tellingly, the computer-generated automatic alt text function of my PowerPoint offered the following descriptors for these images. A picture containing ceramic ware, porcelain. A picture containing outdoor, rock. Paper visually translates in the screen as something mineral, hard, and unyielding. The seamless illusionism of Hartfield's flattened montages was further augmented by the processes of production and reproduction, which involved rephotographing the preparatory artwork and replicating it through the copperplate photogravure process in which most magazines were printed. The result was a montage that was characterized by continuity of surface bound into a mass circulation journal, in critical dialogue with the photo reportages that preceded it and followed it, occasionally in content, but primarily through the imitation of their matter, their medium, and their form. Even their composition was conceived to correspond to the format of the Ait set. With a few exceptions, the photo montages are vertically composed like paper. Hartfield's photo montages imitate mainstream photojournalism in order to intervene critically within this very mechanically reproduced illusionism, the new capitalist mode of production, reproduction, and subject construction. The last section, paper and kinship. Importantly, and unlike many of the previous examples of montage, this paper and these pictures were made for holding, leafing, touching, sharing. Bound into a mass circulation magazine, A Leaf Among Leaves, Hartfield's montages were subject to the peripatetic fate of a picture magazine. Read, handed on, tossed aside, ripped apart to hold the day's fish or potato peelings, or fastidiously collected, disassembled, hung on the wall. The life of a paper weekly was manifold and part of the vernacular, not inevitably destined for a gallery space. Readers are not market abstractions here, but sentient bodies whose limbs hold and support the paper, whose torsos are enfolded over and around it. Our flesh touches the newsprint, turning the page according to our own tempo, hurried or slow, distracted or attentive. Flip the page too hastily or abruptly, though, and the paper will rip because it's thin. So a certain degree of leisure is built into the very act of reading the paper magazine. Unfolding in time and alternating between stasis and movement, the experience of reading is subtly mobile, like the wandering eye. It is also potentially social. In the Ait set imaginary, reading occurs in mutable environments, not designed solely for reading. More than an optical and cognitive process of decoding text images combinations, magazine reading is an embodied active experience of temporal duration and spatial articulation, involving repetitive movement, touch, emotional response. Paradoxically, one of the effects of mechanical replication of photography was to reinstitute a physical intimacy with the image, facilitating proximity to normally distant objects or phenomena. The viewer of the magazine manually handles printed photographs of faraway objects, uniting through skin the surfaces of photomechanical replication and the human body. Touch, as Constance Classen has memorably phrased it, annihilates distance. In this remontaged, recontextualized Hartfield picture of 1937, the physical experience of perusing a magazine, touch and sight collaborate in the temporal unfolding of reading, the internalization of content, and the processes of cognition. A specialized skin tissue, vision, is an extension of touch. Touch is a modality of vision. Latent with political potential, beholding the photographic magazine not only summons proximity or identification through sensate transmissions, but it also momentarily integrates the beholding body with other phenomenal bodies. In the here and now, we are simultaneously transported elsewhere. Reading places us in relation to other bodies, other spaces beyond our own. We are substantive, yet we are interdependent with other entities. In the April 1931 special issue called Life and Struggle of the Black Race, the photographs, text, and their accompanying layouts do their utmost to summon an empathic reader on a haptic and intuitive register. This edition is about human skin, its color, its fragility, its pain, its power, or the imposed lack thereof. The experience of bodily vulnerability is replayed within the magazine through stories of suffering, demeaning physical inspections, grinding labor, human subjugation. We see raw flesh at the mercy of steel chains, heavy parcels, stinging whips, and coarse hangman's nooses. On the fourth leaf of the magazine, two muscular male arms, one white, the other black, thrust forcefully in unison along the right-hand side of the page, their fingers clenched into tight fists. Only the backs of their heads are visible in the lower left. They implicate and incite a third body, the reader's body, to partake in the politics of communist unity, urged on by the accompanying poem. The declarative we of the poem includes us. The rhymes, declamatory cadences, and rhythmic meter amplify the Mercado message of robust unity in the photo montage. Whether black or white, in struggle united, we know only one race, we only know one enemy, the exploiting class. AIZ readers, or AIZ readers, I keep bouncing between languages, are to enjoy the triplication of arms and clenched fist, including our very own, and clasped along the page, extended alongside the two. And here I just mean, when you're reading it, you're holding the magazine on the right-hand side, and so you're holding it, and your arm is right next to these other arms. And so there is a replication of the hands in the picture, in your own. These proletarian Rückenfiguren provide a visual echo of our reading head, which is slightly turned to the right, and of the hand that holds the paper magazine. Our own arm enters our field of vision, joins in their display of power and solidarity, and assimilates the real body with the territory of photographic illusion. The photo montage, in other words, adroitly incorporates our unself-conscious act of holding and reading this paper magazine, transforming our bodily gesture into an inadvertent endorsement of communist politics. This motif of clenched fists, the symbol of communist solidarity, was regularly invoked and duplicated by the reader's hand, grasping the page of the journal along its right edge, affecting a continuity between photograph and viewer's flesh. This magazine was also reduced in slides and smuggled into the border into Nazi Germany from its Prague exile, becoming a part of external resistance. I don't have photographs of the mini AIZ, but these are examples that I found in the Hoover Institute when I was doing my research, which is in Stanford. And these are basically advertisements for, say, the Rolleiflex, and the first couple pages are about the Rolleiflex, for example, and then within it, there are messages from the Communist Party. This was part of the print culture, the physical paper culture that was enlarged and reduced, smuggled in to the border, and used to subvert National Socialism. Anthropomorphizing paper as I have, lending it an agentic body and affects, imagining its transformation from invisible object to collaborative subject, highlights paper's role as our companion in scarcity, grief, fear, fatigue, rage. It is also an ally in building community, collectivity, and resistance. Paper's companionate presence and delicate beauty needs conjuring, but once summoned, its agency in the everyday and in connecting history to the present is foundational. It is vital matter, to borrow Jane Bennett's turn of phrase. It's a recipient skin that connects bodies and worlds. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here to learn and to speak about paper and drawing. Thank you to the organizer of this symposium for their kind invitation. Today, I would like to discuss a practice employed by Pablo Picasso, one that gave rise to the title of this talk, Paint the Blank White Paper White. This sentence seems nonsense, but it is nonetheless a reality in some of its particular. In order to explain, I will first need to specify what I mean by white paper is and the relativity of these characteristics throughout the centuries. I will then briefly describe the technological innovations that enable paper makers to enhance the whiteness of paper. After having presented specific artworks as example of this practice, I will also discuss the type of paper used, the paint layer, and the media employed. I will then investigate whether the paper used has the same signification as a traditional prepared paper, or one which Pablo Picasso wanted to have whiter than white, and why. So, going back to the beginning, let's discuss paper. Drawing paper is a type of paper that dates to the 19th century. Before this period, artists picked up paper in the standard production, according their preferences and the characteristics of the paper, texture, size, color, weight, and of course price. Here I will discuss some technical aspects of the papers and their technological origins in order to develop my thesis. Among the characteristics of drawing paper, the two main parameters involved are the surface texture and its good quality composition. Surface texture is really important. There are two types of look-through, which is a term that describes the structure of a paper's fiber and its transparency. The more ancient type of look-through is laid and the more modern is wove. The difference between the two depends on the construction of the mesh of the paper mold. The laid paper mold is made by sewing two types of metal threads. Schematically, the laid lines in green on the slide, horizontal and thin, are sewn on the chain lines in orange, vertical, widely spaced and thicker. The imprint are patterned when liquid pulp is poured over. In inraking light, you see that laid paper has a grainy surface that is slightly irregular. And wove paper was invented in England in the 1750s by the paper maker Werkman. The elaboration of a fine meshed wire offered a very smooth and regular paper. After seducing all of the printers, wove paper was quickly adopted by the artists at the end of the 18th century. Producing a high-quality paper involves the mastery of the nature of the raw material, its mechanical and chemical treatments, and any additives. These factors also determine the color of the paper and its quality as well. So, for hundreds of years in Europe, rag, either linen or hemp, was the only raw material used to make paper. I will rely on the work of Peter Bauer to underscore the obsession of European paper making with producing a bright white paper. Traditionally, after a meticulous sort of the rags by colors and their cleaning, they were wetted and put into piles to rot and soften slightly. Then, the mechanical treatment by pounding with wooden stampers increased the separation of the cellulose fibers and produced a pulp. All these steps and the use of pure water are very important for the whiteness of the paper and its stability. But what is white paper? To describe the color of different papers, the generic adjective white is woefully inadequate in evaluating the brightness of such papers. To support my idea, I want to use this paper sample book to point out the definitional relativity of the adjective white. It contains three separate headings: color, texture, and thickness. I will only address the first aiding color. From top to bottom, it contains two samples with a blue tint, a bright white sample that is the closest to our copying paper, a white, followed by three samples of cream, two beige, and a brown. Cream 1 is described by the authors as close to the highest achievement of a 16th century paper maker. And they indicate that cream 3 represents an increased color result of the indentation at any stage of pulp making. They also state that blue-white, bright white, and white samples reflect the ambition to produce a whiter paper and gave rise to many of the developments in paper making. First, use of bluing agents to correct white paper. Then bleaching is rapidly adopted by paper makers after the discovery of chlorine in 1774. They use it to whiten the rags and to lighten the dark or soiled ones. The white sample could not have been achieved before this date. And bright white would have been just as unimaginable in the 16th century as before 1930. This sample does not contain any fluorescent brightener, even though they are present in many contemporary bright white papers. You can see the difference of fluorescences on this slide. Optical brighteners serve the same function as a bluing agent. Let's go back to Picasso's art. The instances of white painted paper in his work are principally found in his cubist papier collé. They are a singular category among the many other types of papers. The imitation wood paper and the newspaper and music scores, the wallpapers, the white papers, the black ink brush papers, and the mass-tinted papers. I will provide some examples to highlight these particular parties. Some white painted papers are the primary supports of the collage, as here, the paint layer is not applied until the edges of the sheet. There is now a slight contrast between the white primary support paper and this white layer. The grain of the surface is suitable for charcoal. There, the white paint is brushed horizontally on the paper and creates a specific grain for the graphite pencil. And here, the white and matte paint layer covers the entire sheet. It's quickly brushed and quite irregular. Other instances of white painting paper are found in cut elements of compositions. Here I present them in chronological order. These shapes are sometimes an outline of an object, here a guitar, but more often geometrical shapes. The half of these shapes do not have any drawing on their surface, while the other parts are drawn with charcoal. One or several straight line segments cross them. In the two cases, they look more like flattened. What significance does this have? Why paint a blank white sheet of paper white? I will analyze the material elements of this tautological act one by one. The paper used is always an Ingres paper. I observed near one corner of these primary supports the watermark Ingres in cursive script, followed by a number. In the opposite corner, I saw the countermark as described on the slide. This is the countermark of Catel et Farcy, a Parisian wholesaler of drawing papers since 1886. In spite of its prestigious name at discretion in the 1850s, Ingres was the generic name for low-quality drawing paper. In the catalogues, it was described as a paper for sketches available in several colors. Its price is always low in the 1910s, and this was its first advantage for Picasso. Its second advantage was its light texture, which was ideal for powdery media, such as pencil graphite, charcoal, or pastel drawings. Several teaching manuals at this period recommended it for charcoal drawings. Ingres was produced by several paper makers, such as Canson, Joanneau, and Arche in France, or Pietro Miliani in Italy. They produced a complete range of Ingres papers with different qualities and colors. Also, many wholesalers ordered their Ingres papers with their own countermark, among which Catalan Farsi for our previous example, or Sennelier, and you have a sample book here. So far, I have given you a lot of information about paper, but what can I say to you about the paint layer? It will be only visual information because, as of yet, no analysis have been realized. This paint layer is white, thin, and matte. Its aspect is similar to that of gouache. The pigment used has a small granulometry. The surface is not always smooth and homogeneous. The brush strokes are visible in thickness on the right picture and in the corner of the left papier collé. The artists sometimes stopped painting just before reaching the edges of the sheet. These observations lead to several questions. Did Pablo Picasso want to achieve a smooth and regular surface as a white prepared paper for metal point? Did he apply the kind of ground as for the canvas? Or did he want to obtain a whiter than white paper? If Picasso wanted to imitate the support of metal point drawing, he would have coated a gesso-like ground onto the primary support. Once dry, this ground offered a matte, very regular and slightly textured surface. This point is really important because metal point cannot be used on an unprepared paper. The purpose of the traditional prepared paper seems quite different from the white painted paper, the papier collé. For metal point, the ground is used to homogenize the surface of the laid paper in terms of texture and to allow the grip of the metal particles. Charcoal does not need a prepared ground. The texture of the paper, laid or wove, is sufficient to retain the carbon particles. Moreover, the line of the metal point is very different from that of charcoal in terms of width of the line, color, intensity, and texture. We can appreciate this difference of drawing with two examples from 1920s during the neoclassical period of Picasso. The artist clearly knew of metal point drawing and he did, indeed, quoted it. Here, it's clear that the original primary supports could not be described as white. The preparation covers more or less the surface of the sheet, and the brush strokes are clearly noticeable. Nevertheless, it offers a quite uniform surface for a delicate and linear drawing. The second hypothesis is to consider that this white paint layer is comparable with the ground of the canvas, which I define as a film in a painting which lies between the support and the paint proper. As for the prepared paper, the basis for a ground for oil painting consists of a mixture of opacifying pigment to give body, lead or zinc white, and a binder, more often linseed oil. In the 20th century, the ground was usually white, and most of the canvases were industrially prepared. I have chosen to present two paintings with unexpected grounds. The first one is Le Peintre et son modèle, painted on a dishcloth. Under the handmade ground, you can see red strips in the corner. Different steps of the work are simultaneously visible in this painting. Second-hand canvas, homemade ground, pencil drawing. and the beginnings of the painting of the model. The second example is a cubist still life key. The technical description is charcoal on prepared and scratched canvas. It could be a reemployed canvas or a deliberate choice by Picasso to let the ochre ground of the canvas come through. It became a part of the composition by creating colored shapes similar to the frequent ochre tone in his cubist productions. From Dörner's definition of a ground for canvas, I will try to determine if, as for painting on canvases, the white layer in the papier collé is like a ground. As for prepared paper for metal point, the ground makes the surface tighter. That is to say, an homogeneous surface with a thin grain due to small granulometry of the pigment. However, the white paint in the papier collé is brushed and not always regular. It's not a tighter surface. And there is no need to look for a non-absorbent support for the Ingres paper, because in the papier collé, not in the papier collé, but all the times, it decides during its making, and Picasso used only charcoal. At this point of my talk, the notion of durability will remain outstanding, even it initially concerns more the adhesion of the oil painting on the canvas than anything else. But personally, I believe that the color white and its brightness could be the most important considerations for the artist. Do not forget that in a papier collé there are many different types of paper. The imitation wood paper and all the printed elements are metaphoric textures and colors, and they introduce the real world into the artwork. Some others are made of Fabriano mass-tinted lay papers and constitute solid planes of colors. Personally, I believe the papier collé were a way to continue painting without any paint and brush. These mass-tinted papers were made by mixing mineral pigments into the pulp, thus saturating their colors and making them light stable. All except perhaps the color white that comes from the natural color of the cellulose fibers. It is difficult to approximate the initial color of the white Ingres paper, probably something between white and cream 2 from the sample book. Picasso was a paper lover, but not a paper maker. He was aware of the different qualities of papers and of the natural light sensitivity of the paper. As he could not yet order his own paper or buy the most high-quality papers, it's possible that he expressly chose to perennialize the whiteness of paper by painting it white. Aware of how the paper would age, he preemptively assured its color stability in its compositions, and, in so doing, preserved the relationship between content and form. Covering the paper sheet with a thin white layer could have two objectives. The first was intellectual and tautological in the spirits of the Cubist enterprise, and the second was the need to fix its definitive color and to establish a subtle contrast of whites. In a way, it diverts the principle of the ground layer. This white paint layer is a color for itself and not a ground. To conclude, Ingres is a really multi-purpose paper. Picasso largely used this paper in the 1910s because it was cheap and good quality, and made with rags. Even after 2 centuries of deep evolutions of the paper making, paper is still not sufficiently white, or I should say stable. Moreover, its original white color remains unknown. Nevertheless, if I were to paraphrase Peter Bauer, I would say that in the papier collé, Picasso transformed this Ingres paper to obtain a white surface. With no pun intended, the whiteness of the paper is really a playground for Pablo Picasso. And 20 years later, with the set Il neige au soleil, he revisited this brightness and this relationship between the support and the drawing. Here, the black calligraphy contrasts with the white paper as a mark in the snow, and the large O in the word soleil could be compared with the sun. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me and giving me the chance to introduce here an artist who is right at the heart of the subject under discussion, Hendrik Nicolaas Werkman, who was an avant-garde artist and a professional paperman. Werkman was born in 1882 in the village of Leens, almost right up by the dike near the Waddenzee, in the Dutch province of Groningen. He died in 1945. I think Werkman may have a unique position here among avant-garde artists who expressed themselves on paper, because he was a printer by trade, and from 1908 ran his own printing business in the center of the city of Groningen, where he had moved in his youth. If anyone knows of more artists who were also professional printers, I would very much like to hear about them. The conference is still young, so who knows what unexpected connections may turn up. After Werkman had opened his print shop in 1908, his main focus was the expansion of his business, from a small factory space to a printing works he built himself. He rapidly rose among the many printers in the city until by 1917 he was, as he says himself, among the first 4 printers in Groningen. The printed matter from his business in the early years is nothing exceptional. Here you see a few examples: a dissertation, some bills, and a periodical for British soldiers in the local internment camp during the First World War. All very conventional. However, things start to change in 1918, the year of the foundation of the Groningen Artists Society, De Ploeg. De Ploeg means plough, but also team. Because of his friendship with the first chairman, Werkman is the natural candidate for all printed matter related to the society. Also, as he does some painting himself of a Sunday, he soon becomes a working member, showing his paintings in exhibitions, designing posters, and participating in live drawing sessions. At the same time, around 1920, his business starts to flounder due to a combination of general economic circumstances and overconfident investments. To avoid bankruptcy, he has to sell the building of his printing works, which he had built just 10 years earlier. He downsizes his business and transfers what is left to 2 floors in a former warehouse on the edge of the city centre. Here, several things happen at the same time. Firstly, because he has less personnel, he most likely has to do much more in the printing business himself, not mainly running it from his office, as he must have been used to in the prosperous years. To be clear, he was not trained as a compositor or a printer. He was the son of a vet and therefore destined to be the owner of a print shop rather than a worker in a print shop, though his name might suggest otherwise. However, by 1922-23, things have changed and he has to get his hands dirty. This closer contact with type, ink, presses and paper is one factor at play here. Another factor is that in 1923 De Ploeg, now a group of heterogeneous but in part progressive, innovative artists shaking up cultural life in Groningen, has a studio come exhibition space in the warehouse where Werkman has his business, on the floor above him in fact. The comings and goings of his artist friends must have been a stimulus as well, and a constant reminder that he has other talents and ambitions which are now rising to the surface. This leads to the publication in 1923 of his own avant-garde magazine, The Next Call, to which I will return, and at the same time, the first prints, in which he uses the tools of his trade in innovative and deliberately improper ways. For instance, inking the backs of wood type, printing slowly on a hand press in experimental techniques in which it is impossible to achieve editions of identical copies, which of course is the whole purpose of conventional printing. From 1923 until his death in 1945, he will print hundreds of these druksels, as he calls them, in a technique that is constantly evolving, using printers' materials, inking rollers, and from around 1930, stencils. Some of the druksels are printed in small editions, never completely identical, but most are one-offs. Also, his printed matter for the ploeg gets this unconventional treatment. Thanks to Werkman, the Artist Society's catalogues, posters and other printed matter are among the most exciting of their kind in this period in the Netherlands and far beyond, and they are partly responsible for the ploeg's avant-garde reputation. From 1923, Werkman's print shop quickly becomes an artist studio. But all the while, part artist studio I have to say, but all the while he keeps his business going, right through the Second World War, until he is arrested by the German police in March 1945, a month before the liberation of Groningen, and shot just 3 days before Canadian troops reached the city. The reasons for his arrest and death have never been fully cleared up. He had no links with the Dutch resistance as far as we know, but there must have been suspicions about his printing business, and he did do some of his finest printing for a clandestine publisher, De Blauwe Schuit, to which I will return. This was by way of introduction. Now let's have a closer look at Werkman's relationship with paper. One of the fundamental elements in his work, both as a printer and as an artist, he did paint on canvas, but the majority of his work is on paper. Like any printer, Werkman had a large stock of paper, which was a valuable asset, as becomes evident, for example, when his financial situation deteriorates in the early 1920s. One of his main creditors is a large paper supplier, Proost in Amsterdam. Werkman's use of paper throughout his activities as a printer and as an artist, and specifically the interconnections between these two areas, have so far not been systematically studied. Did he use the same paper for both? And if so, are we able to recognize the paper from his business in his prints and in his own publications? This is a complicated question because on the one hand, only very little of the day-to-day products of his business have survived. So it's hard to get a good picture of the types of paper he would normally buy and use. On the other hand, his artistic oeuvre is quite large, which is why I'm going to limit myself here to 2 clusters of work that stay within the theme of this conference. That is, 2 series of small-scale publications which stand out because of the unique quality of Werkman's typography and illustrations, and which were meant to be distributed among like-minded subscribers. I will give a short introduction to both and look at Werkman's choice of paper in each. Cluster number 1 is Werkman's magazine The Next Call. In September 1923, an unknown number of members of the ploeg and maybe some friends outside this circle receive this announcement, headed Groningen, Berlijn, Moscow, Parijs. Its international ambitions are immediately clear, even though they are tongue-in-cheek, putting Groningen on the same level as the 3 metropolises. I presume, by the way, there's a reference to the header of the Style magazine. Its author, also internationally called Travailleur and Compagnie, urges the reader to take action and shake off convention, and he announces the publication of the first issue of a periodical, which is sent to the same group of recipients a few days later. This has no title yet. Its pages are filled with Werkman's own texts in Dutch, German and French. Along the edges of the pages runs a slogan in bold wood type: Een ril doorklieft het lijf dat vreest de vrijheid van de geest. A shudder rips through the body that fears the freedom of the spirit. A few weeks later, the second issue appears, bearing the English title The Next Call, and over the next 3 years, 7 more issues follow at irregular intervals, mostly containing Werkman's own texts and experimental druksel illustrations. From issue number 4 in 1924 onwards, Werkman exchanges copies with the publishers of other avant-garde magazines, such as Theo van Doesburg of De Stijl and I.K. Bonset of Mécano, Kurt Schwitters of Merz and Michel Seufort of Het Overzicht. He boasts about his contacts on the back of issue number 6, and some copies of magazines and correspondence also show the network he manages to create around The Next Call. Now, the makeup of each issue is different. The Next Call doesn't seem to be designed as a conventional periodical at all. There are just 3 elements which more or less bind the whole series together: the title, the size, and the paper. The paper Werkman uses for the Next Call is the same in almost all of the issues: neutral white medium weight text paper. The exceptions are significant. The first announcement, which is printed on very lightweight purplish paper, and the last, the emotionally loaded 9th issue, dedicated to the Serbian avant-garde artist Ljubomir Micic, with its poignant prose poems in German. Around this point in time, November 1926, Werkman is again in dire straits financially and has to downsize his business once more. The paper he chooses here is grey, handmade laid paper with a watermark, which he had used for the first 9 Druksel prints of 1923 and 24. Significantly, therefore, he returns to his first radical experimental prints for this last call. Where, or more importantly, for what purpose he bought it, we don't know. I haven't yet found examples of the use of this paper in his day-to-day printing. Later on, during the war, he will use the same type of paper again, both for printing and for Druksel prints. Now, at this stage of our knowledge, it is hard to tell if here Werkman redeployed the paper he had bought for his business for artistic purposes. However, I do not think this handmade paper was meant to be used for covering the kind of humdrum printed matter that he turned out in his print shop. He must have saved it for some special use. Now to the second cluster of work, which really begs the question if Werkman used paper from his stock. The series of 40 booklets and prints he designed and printed for clandestine publishing venture De Blauwe Schuit, or the Blue Barge, between 1941 and 44. Fortunately, we know quite a lot about the production of many of these, because Werkman was a prolific letter writer, especially during the war, and most of his letters concerning his activities for De Blauwe Schuit have survived. However, these publications differ from the Druksels and the Next Call in the sense that they were commissions, designed and printed for a group of 3 editors, a scientist, a vicar and a teacher, who in November 1940 started this tiny dilettante publishing company. They wanted to send a message of encouragement to their friends and acquaintances, starting with a poem by the Dutch poet Martinus Nijhoff on an incident during the war against Spain in the 1570s, with strikingly topical parallels with the situation in the Netherlands during the German occupation. This first print was not designed by Werkman, just typeset and printed, but from the off, the team clicked and the 39 pamphlets, booklets and portfolios with prints that followed were designed by him. The best known of these being the 2 series of prints illustrating stories from Martin Bulb's Hasidic legends. Of course, distribution was limited and had to be done in covert ways, but the list of authors, recipients and subscribers is impressive nonetheless, from Willem Sandberg, curator and future director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, to the architect Mart Stam and the photographer Paul Germont-Pré. Now, as you can see here, I always love showing this picture because it's so spectacular. The Blauwe Schuit series is characterized by variety, even more so than the Next Call, not just in terms of the content, shapes and sizes, but also in the choice of paper. The series is the fruit of a collaboration which gave Werkman a lot of freedom in design and execution, but these were still commissions, and this meant that under normal circumstances, Werkman would have been able to buy paper especially and charge it to the publisher. However, circumstances were not normal. There was, of course, a paper shortage during the war, meaning that the acquisition of paper became severely restricted. Furthermore, these publications, with their implicitly anti-German content, were obviously prohibited anyway. So, for that reason as well, it would have been impossible for Werkman to buy paper officially when permits for printing became compulsory. So when I started looking into this aspect of the Blauwe Schuit publications, I wondered if maybe Werkman had little choice. That is, if he had to make do with a variety of odds and ends he had lying about, being forced to use up his stock and even sometimes choosing paper not normally used for printing books. For instance, in the first publication for the Blauwe Schuit, which Werkman designed, he used ordinary brown wrapping paper for the cover, which would seem an example of a kind of make do and mend solution. However, we know from his letters that he ordered his paper in early this paper in early 1941 specifically for the cover of this edition. Therefore, he must have chosen it deliberately for its effect. He uses the same paper again in several other publications for the Blauwe Schuit. And this is the picture revealed again and again in the letters. Yes, it is clear that he routinely inspects his stock to see if he has something in store, but with great regularity he also writes about ordering new paper. We see a combination of these two approaches in one of the last Blauwe Schuit publications, the Houtdiefstal, or the wood theft, from 1944. On the cover, Werkman used cardboard with a wood grain in relief, which he lightly covered in brown ink. It is the same paper he had used for a menu card for a festive dinner for the ploeg in 1938, and presumably was a leftover. I have found a nice, appropriate piece of cardboard, as he wrote in a letter. Here's a picture I took myself. I hope you can see how the wood grain lines up, so it's really the same paper. For the pages of the Houtdiefstal, he used a very distinctive reddish paper, which he had used before for the catalogue of a ploeg exhibition, coincidentally also in 1938. However, here we can be sure this is not a remnant, because in the autumn of 1943 he writes he is expecting a small quantity of exactly this paper, which he had managed to order. All in all, it seems as though Werkman's natural tendency to use the tools of his trade in an improper way gets more prominent in his use of paper as well. Apart from the wrapping paper I mentioned earlier, he also uses other kinds of sometimes very cheap paper, which would be scorned by conventional printers. About this particular example, a text by Martin Luther, published by the Blauwe Schuit in 1941, he writes, "The cover is the cheapest paper there is." In another instance, he even suggests using ordinary newsprint, but decides against it, as it wouldn't have enough character for a publication such as this. In each of these cases, clearly Werkman makes aesthetic choices, not economical or expedient ones. He also manages to lay his hands on some antique paper. The pages of an old ledger, here on the left, and the discolored and slightly shop-soiled paper from a 19th century paper mill, similar to the paper he used for the first druksels and the last issue of the next call. And he borrows, between inverted commas, some paper left for safekeeping at his business by an acquaintance. In short, he does everything to find the right kind of paper, which could be cheap or expensive, fibrous or silky smooth, the right color, the right ink, the right type, to produce the effect he has in mind. Now to conclude, when we compare Werkman's use of paper in the next call with that in the Blauwe Schuit series, it appears his sensitivity to the possibilities of paper as a medium expanded dramatically in the intervening decades. Werkman's creativity blossomed during the war, causing an explosion of productivity leading to hundreds of druksel prints. It was certainly stimulated by the feedback he got from the editors and subscribers of the Blauwe Schuit and the rise in attention his work received. But there may also have been something else at play here, which was directly linked to the conditions and shortages of the war, something he wrote about in a letter to his friend Paul Germont-Pré, and which is in fact partly a love letter to paper. I quote, "Paper really is something that actually hasn't been appreciated enough because people were, as so to speak, bombarded with it in the good times. It is always there in abundance and in an abundance of varieties, far too many varieties, far too many sizes and weights and qualities." And he continues, expressing his delight in the materiality of paper in a way only a professional paperman could. "There is paper so lovely that all you'd want to do is stroke it and otherwise leave it pristine. Er is papier zo mooi dat je het alleen maar zou willen aaien en het verder ongerept laten." Thank you very much.